It's a great pleasure to be here again and joined by someone whom I've gotten to know a little bit over the past few years, Chris Cox. The discussion today is entitled, Chris, Vipassana 2020, and that's something that you said you wanted to talk about and title it that way. So for those of us who don't know or understand, could you give us a quick overview on Vipassana?
Yeah, the first grader overview.
Yes.
Most people here probably already, hi everyone. A lot of people here probably know what Vipassana is. It's a Pali-Sanskrit word that means insight is probably the best translation that we have, and it's also a practice of meditation, which from the teacher that I learned from, which was S.N. Goenka and the lineage of S.N. Goenka centers that have been set up. I didn't learn from him, but I learned from his teachers and his courses. Vipassana is part of the way that you learn to practice. There's sila, which is morality. There's samadhi, which is the quiet mind. And then there's panya, which is wisdom, which is achieved through, and I'm just giving you what he says. This is not my insight. Which is basically scanning the body to understand the reality that a lot of our thoughts and experiences are manifest in the body as physical sensations. The reason I think it's an interesting title is Vipassana is a technology that's 2,500 years old. And I'm in the technology industry. And I would say after the internet and the smartphone, Vipassana may have been, for me personally, the most interesting technology I've learned about. And I think it's easy to focus on the new, and I think that's okay and important. But I think part of what's so interesting about discovering an ancient technology is to realize how powerful it can be.
Chris, you've, to my knowledge, never spoken publicly before, certainly in an audience like this, about your practice and the contemplative tradition that you're following. Why now? Why do you want to talk about this at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is I have a bit more time. I was at Facebook for 13 years. I left recently. In most of my public appearances, people didn't really want to hear about my kids and my meditation. They wanted to hear about new products and protecting elections. And, that was all really important. And I tried to be careful not to, other than in my composure, bring myself into the equation too much. But I spoke internally a lot. And actually, there was a summit at Facebook 5 years ago where leaders were asked to get up and speak to the entire HR and recruiting team, which at that time was about 800 people.
Wow.
Just to speak a little bit about how you came to work. And I chose to speak about my experiences on Goenka retreats and with my daily practice and just how important and powerful it was for me to be able to come and have a stressful job and also to be present and to be compassionate and to be also dialed in, disciplined. And I had so many people come up to me afterwards and they're like, Chris, we've seen you speak so many times, that's the best. Just because it was super personal. And it wasn't about here's a new product I've been working on, it was just about here's my morning. And then a handful of people came back afterwards and were like, we went on a retreat and we're so glad we did it. And it was a good reminder to me that sometimes you don't realize what you should reveal.
And during those talks internally, would you go back to the origin story about how you came to?
A little bit.
Well, why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, I mean, so I went to Stanford, and part of the reason I went there is there's a freshman year program called SLE, which is Structural Liberal Education, and it's basically a year-long great books program. So for a year, you're just reading the original works, starting from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana and Gilgamesh, and going all the way up through Marx and Beauvoir and Nietzsche and Freud and Kant and all of it. And that's a huge part of the reason I wanted to go to school there.
Yeah.
And the guy who started the program is named Mark Mancall, and he's kind of a luminary professor emeritus of the history department. And when he introduces SLE to you, when you're a freshman, it's your first day, and he says, you're going to go on a journey through the history of Western and Eastern thought. You're only going to read original texts. We're going to teach you how to write, and we're going to teach you how to read. But there's two thinkers that I'm going to spend more time on than everyone else. And this is the entire canon of like Western and Eastern thought. And one of them is Karl Marx, and the other one is Buddha. And he says, and this is a person who ended up becoming my academic advisor and who ended up marrying my wife and I, who's here, who's a huge part of my introduction to Buddhism. Hi. Viscera is here, my wife. He explained that Buddha was actually an intellectual revolutionary because what he was challenging was some of the fundamental assumptions that we live with today. Like if you work hard, you can earn money, and then you can buy things and you'll be happy. The promise of capitalism. And Karl Marx was challenging fundamental assumptions, like if we all work really hard, we'll have a global, free trade and things will be okay. And that's, as we know now, both of those two things are like really deep problems that we're struggling with, are the fundamental externalities that are not captured both for the self and for society by capitalism. So anyway, he came up to me after my freshman year and he said, I think you should be my TA. And I began to become his teaching assistant for all these courses on Buddhism. And the other teaching assistant was the woman I married, my wife, Viscera, who grew up in Thai public school where you meditate every day.
Wow.
And so anyway, I studied Buddhism for 5 years and got to know like a lot of the details of the history of it, the different traditions, where they came from, how it was applied to different political theories in Thailand and Bhutan and Tibet. And finally, it was like 2010 or 2011, I'd graduated, I'd been at Facebook, and Visser, my wife, was finally like, all right, it's about time you went on a meditation retreat.
So while you were studying, did you have a practice then?
It was like, you go on a thing for a day.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I got it. And it's like, no, you don't. You don't even understand.
Marx is next.
It's like, there's the ocean, dip your toe in it and run back to shore. And so finally I did a 10-day retreat up in Kelseyville, which is one of the Goenka centers. And it was completely life-changing for me. Many of you, even backstage, I saw a few that have done these retreats. They're really great. They're free. They're open to the public. You do Anapana for 3 days and Vipassana for 7 days. But I came back from that and I felt so silly for having basically studied oceanography and never having been in the ocean. It's like I can tell you how the coral is formed, but I don't know what it feels like.
So now, fast forward, you have a daily practice. So now you are fully an oceanographer.
Well, now I get 1 foot into the water. I think...
Talk about your practice. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I'm trying to do, especially now that I have a bit more time and we have 2 little kids.
How old?
5 and 2.
Wow.
And so I aspire to do the 60-day retreats that a lot of people tell us to go on, but when you have 2 little kids and you're trying to be a good partner and do work, it's hard to bite that off. So I'm trying to do 3 or 4 of the 3 to 4 day refresher courses a year and then have a daily practice in the morning.
And how do the 5 and 2-year-olds cooperate with the daily practice?
Well,
because my 14-year-old is not very well with mine.
I think, the key is to have the window when you can negotiate, with your partner and, your kids, like when is your time? When are you going to exercise? When are you going to work? When are you going to meditate? And for most of the great meditation teachers, when asked by students, like how do I keep my practice up? The first thing they'll say is, don't ask yourself every morning, when am I going to find time today? It's the same as anything with a crazy job. You have to create your calendar in a moment where you're not reacting, and then try and be disciplined about adhering to it.
Last year on this stage, we had another technology leader, Ev Williams.
Yeah.
And Ev was talking about his practice, and presumably both you and Ev remember a time where it would have seemed odd in the technology industry for tech leaders to be meditating. In some ways, it's the opposite now. It's kind of odd if you're not.
Yeah.
What happened?
You know,
And like get under the hood and just...
yeah, you know, I wish I knew.
Yeah.
But I'm really happy that it happened. I think, I mean, if I had to speculate, I think one is that we're in California. And California has always been a frontier and always been interested in exploring non-normal ways of doing things. And that includes daily practice, it includes what we build, it includes our professions, our careers. The film industry is here, the software industry is here. I mean, California is a special place. I think, you know, Jack Kornfield is here. A number of the people that brought meditation here from Thailand and other places came to California first. And I think that's kind of tied up in the soil and the types of people that find themselves here. I think the second reason is the tech industry is really stressful. It's just really, like, it's not an environment that encourages you to take time off and spend time with your family and have a good work-life balance. I mean, we're not in France here. And
this isn't Plum Village.
It's not. And I think there's a lot of great things that come with that. But it also comes with a huge amount of stress and anxiety that does not have a teaching in tech. It's not like you're trained on how to deal with that. And I think that for a lot of people, discovering a meditation practice along with not having a really long commute and paying attention to your friends and family and exercising and eating well is just a really pretty efficient way of helping yourself be healthy.
So as a leader of teams at Facebook, and you were there for 13 years,
Yeah.
how would you both model that attempt at balance, but also as you're seeing all of your team members who are working really hard under a lot of demands, how would you think about creating the space for them to have some semblance of peace or balance, if at all possible?
Yeah. It's funny because I think in the prior Q&A you guys just heard, some of the discussion was just about composure and tone, where like a lot of the micro expressions that a leader portrays have a huge impact on how people feel, I believe. And I would notice it if I didn't get a chance to meditate in the morning or if I didn't exercise. Just like the little lightweight stress that you're carrying or the anger that you're carrying can have a multiplied impact on a group of people who are there for 20 minutes or 30 minutes for feedback.
What would that look like, Chris?
I don't know, raising your voice at the wrong moment, not listening as carefully as you could have, remembering to thank somebody.
Yeah. But in those days where you did have the benefit of your practice, even though you were still feeling that same potentially that same urge to raise your voice or whatever the case may be, is this where the practice then gave you that little additional space to make a choice?
I think so, yeah. And it was also just being present. I mean, at least in my job, there were people who'd waited for a month to come in there and show you something they'd worked on. And the difference between, I'm thinking about the last meeting I just had,
right,
which is so natural. To always be thinking about the next meeting you're going to have and the last meeting that you had. I mean, of course, so much of our minds are anticipating what's coming and reflecting on what we just did wrong. And even just like being 10% better at that, for me, was really rewarding in terms of leaving at the end of the day and feeling like I had done my best.
One of the things that, as you and I were thinking about this session, and we talked about this briefly yesterday, was in your practice, where there is this focus and attention and awareness on your body and the sensations and thoughts, emotions, and feelings, and just being very aware of that.
Yeah.
And then the paradox of, certainly from a social media perspective, of the creation of products that are all about attention being distracted and in other places. First, on a personal level, you had your practice. How would you reconcile that tension to the extent that you saw it as a tension?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge tension there.
Yeah.
And it's something I thought a lot about, and I still think a lot about. With phones, we have in our pocket the most powerful glowing screen, which can do anything. And so much of meditation is learning to not always do what's there. Personally, it's all about schedule. So when I do this, when I do this, when I do this, not always having to think about whether what I should be doing right now is checking my email, was really helpful for me to develop a schedule that worked as an executive, and as a husband and as a father. In terms of building, Facebook and Instagram, we started a well-being team in 2016, whose charter was just to do the world's best research and worked with the world's best researchers on what were the effects of social media on well-being. Both in the best moments, where you had a grandparent in a nursing home for whom it was the only way that they could stay connected with their kids or their grandchildren.
No question.
A soldier abroad for whom this was their way of knowing what was going on at home and sharing their experiences. And also the worst stuff. People who were engaging in tons of social comparison and just felt alone. And social media was a way for them to feel even more sad. And what I learned is that across 2 billion people using social media, you have a lot of highs and a lot of lows. And the research is pretty interesting because we were convinced that if we found the people that were using it like 2 or 3 hours a day, we would go interview them and they'd be like, I'm miserable. And we went and interviewed them. I mean, we created a histogram of time spent, and we went to the people that were using it like 3 hours a day, and we're like, what's going on? Are you really sad and lonely? And they were like, no. Like, I can't go outside. Or like, I'm in Iran. Or like, this is my job, is to find people who are interested in calligraphy in whatever, Kent, Oregon. And this is how I do it, and it's really important to me, and like, I know what I'm doing, thank you very much. Where we found this really interesting gap, and again, this is research that's 2 or 3 years out of date, but there's been a lot published, and there's a lot of ongoing research on the effects of social media on self-esteem, social comparison, well-being, the phenomenon of extreme usage, body image issues, especially for young women. There's like a lot of different areas here, all of which are being researched, and which I'm really proud of how much the company is partnering with academics to allow science to enter into the way that the products are designed. But anyway, the most significant finding from the research a few years ago was that the people who would spend time on social media and then would not feel good about it, if you had to characterize what was the ingredient, what was the most common thing about that, and when you're looking for a gap between I'm using the thing and then afterwards I reflect on it and I didn't feel good, it's kind of what you're looking for, was people who were just passively scrolling and passively watching videos or passively consuming, meaning they weren't actually having interactions with people. They weren't messaging a friend, they weren't having some sort of human interaction. And the analog there was the person who goes to a party, and it's a great party, but they just sit there and watch everyone else have a great time.
Yeah.
And that's a lot more sad than staying at home.
Yeah.
But finding the ways that you can help that person find the conversation that they would engage in is a really meaningful thing to do. And that insight redirected a lot of the product roadmaps for Facebook and Instagram, 2 or 3 years ago. Now, there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm optimistic about sort of the next decade of social media incorporating a lot more of these learnings.
Was there an instance or a couple of instances where your personal practice informed product design or a decision that you made, if you can think of one?
Yeah, probably hundreds.
Yeah.
But none that I can call to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that people don't see from the outside, if you've ever worked at a tech company like Google or Facebook or Apple, there's just like tons of really amazing, hardworking people who work there. and they read the headline like they just don't care, they're just trying to make money, and it's a really hard thing to square. And I think a lot of us who've worked in technology know that. Now, I think the criticism's important, but sort of having the self-esteem and buoyancy to be able to know that, in your heart you care about building a product that's good, and helping people to sort of square this criticism is going to help us make something that's better for people, but also don't doubt yourself. You know.
So now you've left Facebook. It gives you both time to, in some ways, focus on what's truly important with 2 children and your bride, your practice, your well-being. From an outsider's perspective, when you look at tech, good and bad, and you begin to think about the future of tech, what do you see, and how do you see this evolving?
I mean, I think one thing that's neat is, I've gotten to spend some time with the folks at Airbnb, the folks at Uber, the folks at Stripe, a lot of the companies out here that are sort of the next generation of, I think, like really important companies, not just for the tech industry, but for our experience of living, 10, 15, 20 years out. How do we transport? How do we travel? How do we pay? And so much of the culture of these companies is internalizing up front the importance of paying attention to safety and security, and all of the potential misuses up front. And I think there was a general optimism in tech, 10, 15 years ago, that like this is basically going to be good, and if something comes up, we'll deal with it. Right. And that's just completely changed. And I think that's really good. I think it's good for the culture. I think it's good for humbling the ethos while not dulling it of Silicon Valley and of the belief that technology can be a force for good. But just seeing how that's kind of being implemented in a lot of companies, it's not the exception anymore, it's the rule. And I think that's a really good thing. I would say the area I'm the most pessimistic about is climate.
And that's the area you're beginning to spend.
Well, I'm trying to.
For that reason, right?
It's really sad. There are a bunch of technologies that have been created that could be a part of the solution but aren't being adopted. That could be solar, it could be nuclear, it could be electric vehicles. There's like a huge gap where a lot of people aren't voting based on climate.
Right.
It's not a public perception issue that drives voting behavior, in part because it's too far out. But it's an area where the more time I've had to back a little bit away from what I was doing, the more I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but the more I believe that we need a lot more energy on the policy side, on the technology side, on changing public opinion, on getting the right people elected, not just in the US, but in China and India, in Indonesia, where there's huge amounts of our tropical forests, in Brazil. I think you're starting to see the first generation and constituency with young people, led by Greta. Seriously. One of the weird things about climate is it was never clear who the enemy was, and it was never clear who the constituency was.
Yeah.
I mean, you're the expert on this. I'm talking to the oracle on these issues.
I'm glad I'm interviewing you.
But we're starting to finally have a group of people who, in the millions and tens of millions, who believe this is their most important issue. And that's the thing that makes me the most optimistic. And the question will be, how do we convert that will into action?
Yeah. And it makes it even more salient, not just for you, but for me, with your 2 children and my 2 children.
Yeah.
And so, Chris, any parting thoughts or hopes or wishes you want to convey to the Wisdom 2.0?
I'm just glad everybody came out. We're all doing our COVID-19 greetings. Hi. But it's really nice to see everybody out here. It's a huge honor to be here, and it's a huge honor to do something with you, David.
Great.
So thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Cox.
Yeah.